Picture this. You're a wealthy merchant in London, 1587, and you've just finished a lavish feast of roasted swan, honey cakes, and a wine that cost more than most people earn in a year. Your stomach is full, your guests have departed, and nature calls with the urgency that only a rich Tudor meal can inspire. You make your way to your private garderobe, candle flickering in the darkness, and reach for what exactly? If you're imagining soft quilted tissue conveniently perforated for easy tearing, think again. Toilet paper as we know it wouldn't exist for another 3 centuries. What you're about to discover will make you grateful for every roll of charmin you've ever taken for granted. Because the reality of 16th century bathroom habits was far more creative, disgusting, and surprisingly class-conscious than you could possibly imagine. You're about to enter a world where your social status determined not just what you ate or wore, but literally what you wiped with. Where the wrong choice of cleaning material could mean the difference between comfort and agony, health and disease, social acceptance and utter humiliation. This isn't just a story about bathroom habits. It's a window into a society where even the most private human functions reflected the brutal hierarchies that governed every aspect of life. Before diving into these forgotten truths of history, if you enjoy learning about the hidden realities of the past, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient practices together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about how people lived before modern conveniences. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you think you know about cleanliness, privacy, and human ingenuity in the face of basic biological necessity. We'll uncover the surprising materials people used, the elaborate rituals they developed, and the shocking class distinctions that turned even the most basic human function into a symbol of wealth and power. To understand what people used before toilet paper, we first need to understand how fundamentally different the 16th century world was from ours. This was an era when bathing was considered dangerous to health, when most people owned only one set of clothes, and when the concept of privacy as we understand it simply didn't exist. Personal hygiene wasn't just different. It operated on completely alien principles that would horrify modern sensibilities. The very architecture of waste disposal reveals how foreign this world was to our experience. In medieval and early Renaissance Europe, the garderobe, the predecessor to our bathroom, was typically a small chamber built into the outer wall of a castle or manor house. The waste would fall directly into a moat, river, or specially constructed pit far below. There was no plumbing, no running water, and certainly no convenient roll of paper hanging nearby. But here's where it gets interesting. Even the wealthy didn't just improvise randomly. There was actually a sophisticated hierarchy of cleaning materials that reflected not just availability, but social status, regional customs, and even religious beliefs. The choice of what to use wasn't just practical, it was a statement about who you were and where you belonged in society. At the top of the social pyramid, the truly wealthy had options that would seem luxurious even by today's standards. The nobility and wealthy merchants used linen rags, soft, absorbent, and reusable. But these weren't just any old scraps of cloth. They were often made from worn-out undergarments or bed linens, materials that had already proven their softness through use. The finest households would have servants whose job included washing, drying, and maintaining a supply of these cleaning cloths. Imagine the logistics involved. Wealthy families needed to maintain a constant supply of clean rags, which meant having staff dedicated to collecting, washing, and preparing these materials. The washing process itself was elaborate, involving lye soap, boiling water, and careful drying to ensure the cloths remained soft and sanitary. This wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about displaying wealth through the sheer extravagance of using high-quality textiles for such a basic function. The Spanish court, known for its elaborate etiquette and obsession with cleanliness, took this to extraordinary lengths. Courtiers were expected to use only the finest linen, and there were actually protocols governing the proper preparation and use of these materials. The Spanish nobility developed intricate rules about the quality of cloth appropriate for different occasions, with special materials reserved for use by royalty. But even among the wealthy, there were distinctions. The highest nobility might use silk or even velvet scraps, materials so expensive that using them for toilet purposes represented the ultimate display of wealth. These fabrics were often perfumed with expensive oils and herbs, turning even the most basic bodily function into a sensory experience that reinforced class distinctions. French aristocrats developed their own elaborate customs around this practice. They would use specially prepared linen that had been soaked in rosewater or other expensive perfumes, creating what was essentially the world's first scented toilet paper. The preparation of these materials became an art form, with servants competing to create the most pleasant and effective cleaning cloths for their masters. The English upper classes, not to be outdone, developed a system where different grades of linen were used for different purposes. The finest, softest materials were reserved for the most intimate use, while coarser linens might be used for initial cleaning. This created a multi-step process that demonstrated both wealth and sophistication in approaching basic hygiene. But what about everyone else? The vast majority of the population, peasants, artisans, laborers, and even the emerging middle class, couldn't afford the luxury of disposable linen rags. They had to be far more creative, and their solutions reveal incredible ingenuity born from necessity. The most common alternative was what we might politely call natural materials. Leaves were the go-to choice for millions of people across Europe and beyond. But this wasn't a random grab whatever leaf is handy situation. Different cultures developed sophisticated knowledge about which leaves were best for the purpose. In England, mullein leaves were prized for their soft, velvety texture. These large, fuzzy leaves were perfect for the purpose. Soft enough not to cause irritation, absorbent enough to be effective, and plentiful enough to be readily available. People would actually cultivate mullein specifically for this use, tending patches of it near their homes like a primitive toilet paper garden. Other popular choices included lamb's ear, another wonderfully soft plant that grows wild across much of Europe. The leaves are thick, absorbent, and covered with fine hairs that make them remarkably gentle. Experienced users knew to harvest these leaves at just the right stage of growth. Too young, and they weren't large enough to be effective. Too old, and they became tough and scratchy. Moss was another universal favorite, particularly in northern climates where it grew abundantly. Sphagnum moss, in particular, was prized for its natural antiseptic properties. People living in forested areas would collect and dry moss specifically for this purpose, storing it in containers to keep it clean and ready for use. The antiseptic qualities weren't just accidental. People had observed that moss seemed to prevent infections and irritation, making it a genuinely superior choice to many alternatives. But the creativity didn't stop with plants. Corn cobs, once corn was introduced to Europe from the Americas, became incredibly popular. The texture was perfect, rough enough to be effective, but not so rough as to cause damage. Used corn cobs had the added advantage of being readily available as agricultural waste, making them essentially free for farming communities. In coastal areas, people developed entirely different solutions. Smooth stones worn by ocean waves became the cleaning material of choice. These weren't just random rocks. Experienced users knew exactly what size, shape, and texture worked best. Families would collect and maintain supplies of these stones, sometimes passing down particularly good specimens through generations. Shells, particularly larger ones like conch or whelk shells, were also popular in seaside communities. The smooth interior of these shells provided an effective cleaning surface, and their curved shape made them ergonomically suited to the task. Some cultures even developed techniques for modifying shells, smoothing rough edges or creating specific shapes to improve their effectiveness. The ingenuity extended to manufactured alternatives as well. In areas where pottery was common, people would create specially designed ceramic scrapers called passoi. These were small, curved pieces of pottery, often decorated with inscriptions or images that were specifically made for toilet use. The Greeks and Romans had used these extensively, and the practice continued in some regions well into the Renaissance. What's fascinating about passoi is that they weren't just functional. They were often artistic. Archaeological examples have been found with elaborate decorations, jokes, insults directed at political figures, and even religious imagery. Using the bathroom became an opportunity for political commentary, humor, and artistic expression. But perhaps the most ingenious solution came from an unlikely source. The wealthy Romans had used a tool called a xylospongium, essentially a sponge on a stick that was shared in public latrines. While this practice had largely died out by the 16th century, some communities developed similar shared tools for group use, though these were typically made from local materials like bundled grasses or cloth scraps attached to wooden handles. The regional variations in cleaning materials tell us incredible stories about local environments, trade routes, and cultural preferences. In Mediterranean climates, olive leaves were common. They're naturally antimicrobial and have a smooth texture when mature. In northern European forests, people used birch leaves, which have natural antiseptic properties and grow in abundance. Mountain communities often used wool, not expensive processed wool, but the coarse outer wool that sheep naturally shed. This wool was collected, cleaned, and used as a reusable cleaning material. The lanolin in the wool actually provided natural moisturizing properties, making it surprisingly gentle and effective. Trade routes influenced these choices in unexpected ways. Communities along major trading paths often had access to materials from distant regions. Wealthy merchants might use silk scraps obtained through trade, while even common people might have access to exotic leaves or fibers that arrived as packing material in trade goods. The preparation and storage of these materials became an important household skill. Families needed to maintain year-round supplies, which meant harvesting materials at the right seasons, properly drying and storing them, and rationing their use to ensure they didn't run out during winter months when fresh materials weren't available. Women typically managed these household supplies, developing expertise in identifying the best materials, proper harvesting techniques, and effective storage methods. This knowledge was passed down through generations, creating family traditions around something as basic as toilet hygiene. Mothers would teach daughters not just what materials to use, but when to harvest them, how to prepare them, and how to store them for maximum effectiveness. The seasonal nature of many cleaning materials created its own rhythms and challenges. Spring and summer were times for harvesting and preparing natural materials, while winter required careful rationing of stored supplies. Running out of proper cleaning materials during the harsh winter months wasn't just inconvenient, it could be genuinely dangerous to health and comfort. This seasonal cycle also created opportunities for trade and community cooperation. Families might specialize in harvesting particular materials. Those living near water might collect moss or smooth stones, while forest dwellers gathered leaves and lichens. These materials could be traded for other necessities, creating small but important local economies around the most basic human needs. The quality and availability of cleaning materials became markers of social status even among the poor. A family that managed to maintain a good supply of soft, effective materials throughout the winter was demonstrating successful household management and forward planning. Children from such families might even be considered more desirable marriage prospects because they came from households that managed resources effectively. But what happened when even these natural materials weren't available? When harsh winters, crop failures, or other disasters left communities without their usual supplies? The answers reveal the absolute ingenuity of human survival and the lengths people would go to maintain basic dignity and health. During emergencies, people turned to increasingly desperate alternatives. Old rope, unraveled and softened, became cleaning material. Worn-out clothing was carefully preserved and rationed for this purpose. Even paper, when it became more common in the later 16th century, was sometimes used, though it was far too expensive for regular use by common people. The desperation wasn't just about comfort, it was about health and social acceptance. Poor hygiene could lead to serious medical problems, social ostracism, and even economic consequences. A person who couldn't maintain basic cleanliness might find themselves excluded from work opportunities, social gatherings, and marriage prospects. This creates a picture of 16th century life that's far more complex and challenging than we often imagine. Every aspect of daily life, including the most private moments, required planning, skill, and resourcefulness. There were no simple solutions, no convenient products to purchase, and no fallback options when primary choices weren't available. The story of pre-toilet paper hygiene isn't just about what people used. It's about how they adapted, innovated, and survived in a world where even basic necessities required constant attention and creativity. It reveals societies where class distinctions penetrated every aspect of life, where seasonal rhythms governed even the most intimate practices, and where human ingenuity found ways to maintain dignity and health despite incredible challenges. As we continue this journey through the often shocking realities of 16th century bathroom habits, we'll discover even more surprising truths about how different social classes approach these challenges, the elaborate etiquette that governed even private moments, and the unexpected ways that these practices influenced everything from architecture to international trade. The most shocking aspect of 16th century toilet habits wasn't what people used to clean themselves. It was the elaborate social codes that governed when, where, and how these activities could take place. Privacy, as we understand it, was a luxury reserved for the absolute elite. And even then, the concept was radically different from our modern expectations. Picture yourself as a servant in a grand English manor house, tasked with emptying the chamber pots each morning. You would witness firsthand the complex hierarchy that determined not just what people used for cleaning, but the entire ritual surrounding waste disposal. The master of the house might have a private garderobe with a wooden seat, while his guests used portable chairs with removable pots. The family used pewter or ceramic vessels, while servants made do with simple wooden buckets. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. The wealthy often conducted business while relieving themselves. Important meetings, correspondence dictation, and even formal interviews might take place while the nobleman sat upon his close stool, an elaborate wooden chair containing a chamber pot, often decorated with velvet cushions and brass fittings. This wasn't considered crude or inappropriate. It was simply an efficient use of time by people whose schedules were packed with obligations. The French court elevated this practice to an art form. Louis XIV, though he wouldn't be born until 1638, inherited a tradition where courtiers competed for the honor of attending the king during his most private moments. Earlier French monarchs had established this custom, turning even waste elimination into a ceremony of royal privilege. Nobles would literally wait in line for the opportunity to converse with their sovereign while he conducted his business. Spanish nobility developed their own elaborate protocols around these activities. The Spanish were obsessed with cleanliness and propriety, yet they created complex rules governing who could be present during various stages of the toilet process. Different ranks of servants had specific roles. Some could handle the chamber pot, others could only prepare the cleaning materials, and the highest-ranking attendants might be permitted to assist with the actual cleaning process. The English, typically more reserved than their continental counterparts, still maintained their own intricate customs. Tudor-era etiquette manuals actually included instructions on proper behavior during toilet activities. There were rules about how to hold one's posture, what topics of conversation were appropriate, and even specific prayers that should be recited during the process. These weren't just arbitrary social conventions. They reflected deep beliefs about the body, spirituality, and human dignity. Medieval and Renaissance Europeans believed that the soul could be corrupted through improper handling of bodily functions. Specific prayers, proper positioning, and careful attention to cleanliness weren't just about physical health, they were about spiritual purification. The Catholic Church had developed elaborate theological frameworks around bodily functions and cleanliness. Priests regularly gave sermons about the spiritual significance of maintaining proper hygiene, connecting physical cleanliness to moral purity. Confession manuals from the period actually included questions about toilet habits, requiring penitents to admit failures in maintaining appropriate cleanliness standards. Protestant reformers, particularly in England and Northern Europe, took different approaches but were equally concerned with these matters. They emphasized personal responsibility for maintaining cleanliness as a form of honoring God's creation. This created interesting regional differences in how toilet activities were approached and regulated. But what about the common people who couldn't afford elaborate ceremonies or private garderobes? Their solutions reveal incredible community cooperation and shared responsibility that challenges our assumptions about medieval individualism. In many villages, communal toilet facilities were the norm. These weren't just simple outhouses, they were sophisticated community projects that required ongoing maintenance and organization. Villages would designate specific areas for waste disposal, often downstream from water sources and carefully positioned to take advantage of natural drainage. The construction and maintenance of these facilities required community cooperation on a scale that's difficult for modern people to appreciate. Every family contributed labor, materials, and ongoing maintenance. There were village officials whose specific responsibility was overseeing sanitation, ensuring that facilities remained functional and reasonably clean. These communal systems also created their own social dynamics and hierarchies. Families with higher status within the village might have access to better positions within the communal facilities, spots that were more private, cleaner, or more convenient. The politics of waste disposal became another arena where social relationships played out. The timing of toilet activities was carefully regulated in these communities. Different groups, men, women, children, elderly, might have designated times for using the facilities. This scheduling wasn't just about efficiency, it reflected complex social relationships and power structures within the community. Women's toilet practices deserve special attention because they reveal the particular challenges faced by half the population. In an era where feminine hygiene was poorly understood and rarely discussed openly, women had to navigate monthly cycles without modern sanitary products, pregnancy-related changes in bodily functions, and the challenges of multiple layers of clothing that made quick toilet visits nearly impossible. The clothing alone created enormous obstacles. Wealthy women wore elaborate gowns with multiple layers of undergarments, stays, and complicated fastenings that required assistance to remove. A simple toilet visit might require the help of servants, and could take 15 or 20 minutes just to manage the clothing. Poor women, while having simpler clothes, often wore the same garments for weeks or months, making cleanliness a constant challenge. Menstruation created additional complications that modern women can barely imagine. Without disposable pads or tampons, women used rags, moss, or other absorbent materials that had to be washed and reused. These materials were precious resources that required careful management and storage. The washing process itself was challenging. Without hot running water or effective detergents, cleaning these materials thoroughly was difficult and time-consuming. Pregnancy brought its own toilet-related challenges. As women's bodies changed, their needs for bathroom facilities changed as well. The design of chamber pots and toilet seats didn't accommodate pregnant bodies well, creating physical discomfort and practical difficulties. Wealthy pregnant women might have specially designed furniture to address these needs, while poor women simply had to endure the discomfort. Childbirth and postpartum recovery created additional hygiene challenges that required community support and specialized knowledge. Midwives and experienced women developed techniques for managing the toilet needs of new mothers, creating support systems that helped women maintain cleanliness and dignity during vulnerable periods. The elderly faced their own unique challenges in an era without modern incontinence products or easily accessible facilities. Families developed various strategies for caring for elderly relatives who could no longer manage their toilet needs independently. These ranged from specially designed clothing to modified furniture to community support systems that helped maintain dignity for aging community members. Children's toilet training followed completely different patterns than modern approaches. Without diapers as we know them, infants and toddlers wore simple cloth wrappings that required frequent changing and washing. Toilet training began much earlier out of necessity, and children were expected to master these skills quickly to reduce the burden on their families. The economic implications of toilet practices extended far beyond the obvious costs of materials and facilities. Entire industries developed around supplying the materials and services needed for waste management. Rag merchants specialized in supplying cleaning materials to wealthy households. Night soil men made their living collecting and disposing of human waste from urban areas, often selling it to farmers as fertilizer. The textile industry was deeply connected to toilet practices through the demand for cleaning rags and absorbent materials. Used clothing and linens had value specifically because they could be repurposed for cleaning use. This created secondary markets and recycling systems that were essential parts of the early modern economy. Urban areas faced particular challenges that required innovative solutions and significant investment. Cities couldn't rely on the simple disposal methods that worked in rural areas. Human waste had to be collected, transported, and disposed of in ways that wouldn't contaminate water supplies or create health hazards. London, Paris, and other major cities developed complex systems for managing human waste that employed thousands of workers and required ongoing municipal investment. These systems weren't just practical necessities, they were major public works projects that shaped urban development and influenced city planning for centuries. The night soil trade became a significant economic sector in major cities. Workers would collect human waste from private homes and public facilities, then transport it to agricultural areas where it was sold as fertilizer. This created economic relationships between urban and rural areas that were essential to both city sanitation and agricultural productivity. River systems became highways for waste disposal, but this created downstream conflicts between communities. Cities that dumped waste into rivers faced complaints and sometimes legal action from downstream communities whose water supplies became contaminated. These conflicts required negotiation and sometimes led to early environmental regulations. The international implications of toilet practices might seem absurd, but they were surprisingly significant. Diplomatic missions had to navigate different toilet customs when traveling between countries. Ambassadors and their staff needed to understand local practices to avoid giving offense or appearing uncivilized. Trade relationships were sometimes influenced by differences in cleanliness standards and toilet practices. Merchants from cultures with higher cleanliness standards might refuse to do business with those they considered unsanitary. These prejudices could affect commercial relationships and international trade patterns. Military campaigns faced enormous logistical challenges related to sanitation and waste disposal. Armies needed to maintain toilet facilities for thousands of soldiers while on the move, prevent disease outbreaks related to poor sanitation, and respect local customs in territories they occupied. Military engineers developed portable toilet systems and sanitation protocols that were essential to successful campaigns. The religious dimensions of toilet practices extended beyond individual spirituality to influence international relations between different faiths. Islamic, Christian, and Jewish communities had different cleanliness requirements and toilet practices that could create tensions in multi-religious societies. Pilgrimage routes required special attention to toilet facilities and cleanliness standards. Religious authorities had to provide sanitation facilities for thousands of pilgrims while maintaining the spiritual purity required for religious sites. This created complex logistical challenges that required coordination between religious and secular authorities. The medical understanding of toilet practices was primitive by modern standards, but still influenced how people approached these activities. Physicians believed that the position of the body during waste elimination could affect health, that certain cleaning materials could prevent or cause disease, and that the timing of toilet activities could influence overall well-being. Astrological beliefs influenced toilet practices for those who could afford to consult astrologers. Certain times of day, phases of the moon, or seasonal periods were considered more or less favorable for elimination. While this might seem superstitious, it reflected genuine attempts to understand and optimize health through careful attention to bodily functions. The development of medical knowledge about digestion, anatomy, and disease gradually influenced toilet practices throughout the 16th century. As understanding improved, people began to modify their practices based on new information about health and hygiene. The social psychology of toilet practices reveals fascinating insights into human nature and community relationships. The shared vulnerability of basic bodily functions created bonds between people while also reinforcing social hierarchies. Everyone needed to eliminate waste, but how they did it reflected and reinforced their place in society. Status anxiety around toilet practices was significant for people trying to rise in social rank. Newly wealthy merchants might invest heavily in elaborate toilet facilities and cleaning materials to demonstrate their elevated status. The fear of appearing crude or lower class influenced spending decisions and social behavior, in ways that extended far beyond the actual toilet activities. Community shame and honor were deeply connected to cleanliness standards and toilet behavior. Families or individuals who failed to maintain appropriate standards faced social consequences that could affect their economic opportunities, marriage prospects, and community standing. This created powerful incentives for maintaining cleanliness even when resources were scarce. The psychology of privacy and dignity around toilet activities varied significantly between cultures and social classes. What seemed normal and acceptable to one group might be shocking or degrading to another. These differences created social tensions and influenced how different groups interacted with each other. The innovations that emerged from necessity often came from the most unexpected sources. Monastery communities, with their emphasis on cleanliness and order, became laboratories for developing better toilet practices. Monks had access to manuscripts containing ancient knowledge about hygiene, time for experimentation, and resources for implementing new ideas. They developed some of the most sophisticated waste management systems of the era. Benedictine monasteries, in particular, created elaborate systems that combined Roman engineering knowledge with medieval innovation. They built multi-level garderobes with sophisticated drainage systems, developed techniques for processing human waste into safe fertilizer, and maintained supplies of cleaning materials that were far superior to what most secular communities could access. The monastic emphasis on cleanliness wasn't just practical, it was deeply theological. Medieval religious thinkers saw bodily purification as essential to spiritual development. This created communities where toilet practices were taken seriously as both practical and spiritual disciplines. Monks developed detailed rules governing every aspect of waste elimination, from proper posture to specific prayers to appropriate cleaning materials. These monastic innovations gradually spread to secular communities through various channels. Monastery guests experienced superior sanitation systems and sometimes implemented similar approaches in their own homes. Former monks who left religious life brought their knowledge to secular communities. Medical manuscripts copied in monastery scriptoriums preserved and transmitted knowledge about hygiene and health. The influence extended to architecture and urban planning. Monastery designs influenced the layout of noble houses, incorporating improved drainage systems and better positioning of toilet facilities. Cities consulted with monastery engineers when developing public sanitation systems. The practical knowledge developed in religious communities became foundational to improving sanitation throughout European society. But innovation wasn't limited to religious communities. Merchant families, with their international connections and available capital, often pioneered new approaches to toilet facilities and cleaning materials. Their travels exposed them to different practices from other cultures, creating opportunities for combining the best ideas from multiple traditions. Venetian merchants, for example, had extensive contact with Islamic cultures that maintained higher standards of cleanliness than most Christian communities. They observed sophisticated washing systems, superior cleaning materials, and architectural innovations that they adapted for use in their own homes. These adaptations gradually spread throughout the merchant community and eventually influenced broader Italian society. The Hanseatic League, connecting northern European trading cities, created networks for sharing information about sanitation innovations. A new cleaning material discovered in one Baltic port might quickly spread to other League cities. Improved toilet facility designs developed in Hamburg might be implemented in Bergen or Novgorod within months. These commercial networks became highways for spreading sanitation knowledge. Maritime communities faced unique challenges that spurred particular innovations. Ships couldn't rely on ground-based disposal systems, creating needs for portable toilet solutions and effective cleaning materials that could function in confined spaces. Sailors developed techniques for managing waste disposal during long voyages, maintaining cleanliness in extremely challenging conditions, and preventing disease outbreaks in crowded ship environments. The solutions developed for maritime use often found applications on land. Portable toilet chairs designed for ship cabins influenced furniture design in noble houses. Cleaning materials that worked effectively in humid, confined spaces proved valuable for land-based communities as well. Navigation tools and techniques developed for finding safe water sources during voyages helped land-based communities identify clean water supplies. Naval warfare added additional complications to maritime sanitation challenges. Warships carried larger crews for longer periods, faced combat situations that disrupted normal sanitation routines, and needed to maintain fighting effectiveness despite sanitation challenges. Military engineers developed portable toilet systems that could be quickly deployed and easily maintained under combat conditions. The knowledge gained from military sanitation challenges influenced civilian innovations. Techniques for managing waste disposal for large groups proved valuable for cities managing growing populations. Methods for preventing disease outbreaks in crowded conditions helped urban communities address public health challenges. Portable sanitation systems designed for military use were adapted for civilian applications like large public gatherings or construction projects. Mining communities faced their own unique sanitation challenges that required innovative solutions. Underground work environments couldn't accommodate traditional waste disposal methods, creating needs for specialized systems that could function in confined underground spaces. Miners developed techniques for managing sanitation needs during long underground shifts, preventing contamination of water sources in mining areas, and maintaining health standards despite extremely challenging working conditions. The solutions developed in mining communities often influenced other industries facing similar challenges. Underground construction projects adopted mining sanitation techniques. Other industries working in confined spaces implemented similar approaches. The knowledge gained from addressing extreme sanitation challenges proved valuable for less extreme, but still challenging situations. Agricultural communities developed their own innovations based on the intimate connection between human waste and soil fertility. Farmers understood better than anyone the value of human waste as fertilizer, creating sophisticated systems for processing and applying it safely. They developed techniques for composting human waste with other organic materials, timing applications to maximize crop benefits while minimizing health risks, and managing the entire cycle from collection through agricultural application. These agricultural innovations influenced urban waste management systems. Cities began viewing human waste as a valuable resource rather than just a disposal problem. Entrepreneurs developed businesses around collecting urban waste and selling it to agricultural communities. This created economic incentives for better waste collection systems and more efficient processing techniques. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life also influenced toilet practices in farming communities. Planting and harvest seasons created different sanitation needs and opportunities. Winter months required different approaches than summer periods. Agricultural communities developed sophisticated understanding of how to integrate human waste management with seasonal agricultural cycles. Regional variations in toilet practices often reflected local environmental conditions and available resources. Mediterranean communities had access to different materials and faced different challenges than Northern European societies. Coastal areas developed different solutions than inland regions. Mountain communities created different approaches than plains dwellers. These regional differences created opportunities for innovation through cultural exchange. When people from different regions met, through trade, warfare, pilgrimage, or marriage, they shared knowledge about toilet practices and sanitation techniques. The most effective innovations spread between regions, adapted to local conditions and resources. The process of cultural exchange around sanitation knowledge reveals interesting patterns about how practical knowledge spread in pre-modern societies. Unlike theoretical knowledge that might be transmitted through manuscripts or formal education, sanitation knowledge spread through personal experience and practical demonstration. People learned by observing and experimenting rather than through abstract study. Women played particularly important roles in transmitting sanitation knowledge because they typically managed household hygiene and healthcare. When women married and moved to new communities, they brought knowledge about toilet practices and cleaning materials from their birth families. When women worked as servants in different households, they observed and learned different approaches that they could apply in their own families. The role of women in managing household sanitation created informal networks for sharing knowledge about hygiene and health. Women exchanged information about effective cleaning materials, successful toilet facility designs, and techniques for managing family sanitation needs. These networks operated parallel to formal male-dominated institutions, but were equally important for transmitting practical knowledge. Midwives and healers held particularly important positions in these knowledge networks. Their work required understanding of cleanliness and hygiene, giving them expertise that extended beyond their specific medical roles. They often advised families about sanitation practices, recommended cleaning materials for different purposes, and helped communities address sanitation-related health problems. The intersection of medical knowledge and toilet practices created opportunities for innovation and improvement throughout the 16th century. As medical understanding advanced, practitioners began making connections between sanitation practices and health outcomes. This led to recommendations for improved cleaning materials, better waste disposal techniques, and more effective approaches to maintaining cleanliness. Medical manuscripts from the period reveal growing understanding of the connections between cleanliness and health. Physicians began prescribing specific cleaning materials for patients with certain conditions, recommending particular toilet practices for maintaining health, and advising communities about sanitation practices that could prevent disease outbreaks. The development of medical knowledge about hygiene influenced social attitudes toward toilet practices and cleanliness standards. Practices that had been considered optional or purely aesthetic began to be seen as necessary for health. This created social pressure for improved sanitation, even among communities that might not have prioritized cleanliness for other reasons. The economics of cleanliness created complex relationships between different social classes and communities. Wealthy families needed suppliers for their elaborate cleaning materials and sanitation systems. Poor communities needed access to basic sanitation resources and knowledge. These needs created economic relationships and dependencies that influenced social structures and power relationships. Specialized trades developed around supplying sanitation needs for different social classes. Rag merchants collected and processed cleaning materials for wealthy households. Night soil men managed waste collection and disposal for urban communities. Craftsmen specialized in creating toilet furniture and sanitation equipment for those who could afford it. These specialized trades created their own social hierarchies and economic relationships. The most successful sanitation entrepreneurs might achieve significant wealth and social status. Skilled craftsmen who created superior toilet furniture could command high prices and prestigious clients. Even relatively low-status workers like night soil men could achieve economic security through essential services. The regulation of sanitation trades became increasingly important as communities grew and sanitation needs became more complex. Guilds developed standards for sanitation workers and equipment manufacturers. Municipal authorities created regulations governing waste disposal and cleanliness standards. These regulatory systems reflected growing understanding of the connections between individual sanitation practices and community health. The international dimensions of sanitation knowledge exchange reveal surprising connections between distant communities and cultures. Islamic communities in Spain maintained sanitation standards that influenced Christian communities through cultural contact. Byzantine practices influenced Italian communities through trade relationships. Northern European innovations spread to Eastern European communities through political and commercial connections. These international exchanges weren't just one-way transfers of knowledge. European communities also contributed innovations that influenced practices in other regions. The exchange of sanitation knowledge was part of broader patterns of cultural contact and technological transfer that characterized the early modern period. The documentation of different sanitation practices in travel accounts and diplomatic reports created written records that helped preserve and transmit knowledge about hygiene and cleanliness. These accounts provide modern historians with detailed information about toilet practices, while also serving their original purpose of helping travelers understand and adapt to different cultural practices. The religious dimensions of sanitation practices continued to influence how different communities approached toilet activities and cleanliness standards. Protestant emphasis on personal responsibility created different approaches than Catholic emphasis on community standards. Islamic cleanliness requirements influenced practices in communities with Muslim populations. Jewish dietary and cleanliness laws created distinct approaches within Jewish communities. These religious influences weren't just theoretical. They had practical implications for daily life and community organization. Religious authorities needed to address questions about proper sanitation practices. Communities needed to accommodate different religious requirements, and individuals needed to balance practical needs with religious obligations. The intersection of religious requirements and practical needs sometimes created conflicts that required creative solutions. Communities with multiple religious groups needed to develop sanitation systems that met different religious standards. Individuals traveling between different religious communities needed to adapt their practices to different expectations and requirements. As we approach the end of our journey through the complex world of 16th century toilet practices, it becomes clear that what people used before toilet paper was just the beginning of a much larger story about human ingenuity, social organization, and the endless creativity people bring to solving basic problems. The materials themselves, from luxury linen to humble leaves, were just the visible surface of elaborate systems that touched every aspect of society, from architecture to international trade, from religious practice to medical knowledge, from social hierarchies to technological innovation. The legacy of these pre-toilet paper practices extended far beyond their immediate practical applications, creating ripple effects that would influence European society for centuries to come. What began as simple necessity evolved into complex social systems that revealed fundamental truths about human nature, community cooperation, and the endless capacity for adaptation in the face of basic needs. Perhaps most remarkably, the knowledge systems that developed around toilet practices became foundations for broader understanding of hygiene, health, and public sanitation. The careful observation of which materials worked best, which practices prevented disease, and which systems served communities most effectively created empirical knowledge that would eventually contribute to more scientific approaches to public health. The social hierarchies that governed toilet practices also revealed the profound ways that even the most private human activities became expressions of power, status, and cultural identity. A wealthy merchant's supply of fine linen rags wasn't just about comfort, it was a statement about his place in society, his ability to command resources, and his family's commitment to maintaining standards that distinguished them from their social inferiors. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this entire system was its sustainability. Unlike our modern dependence on manufactured products that require industrial production and global supply chains, 16th century toilet practices were almost entirely based on renewable local resources. Communities developed self-sufficient systems that could function indefinitely without depleting natural resources or creating environmental problems. The moss carefully harvested from forest floors would regrow within seasons. The leaves collected for cleaning would be replaced by new growth the following year. Even the elaborate linen rags used by the wealthy were part of recycling systems that extracted maximum value from textile resources before they were finally discarded. These weren't just practical solutions, they were early examples of circular economies that modern environmental thinkers are only beginning to rediscover. The knowledge that women passed down through generations about identifying the best materials, preparing them properly, and storing them effectively represented sophisticated understanding of natural resources and seasonal cycles. A mother teaching her daughter which leaves were softest in spring, how to dry moss for winter storage, or how to prepare linen rags for maximum effectiveness was transmitting complex technical knowledge that ensured family survival and comfort. This intergenerational transmission of knowledge created cultural continuity that connected families to their environments in ways that modern life rarely permits. Children learned not just what to use, but when to harvest it, how to prepare it, and how to manage resources across seasonal cycles. They developed intimate knowledge of local ecosystems and natural processes that made them active participants in sustainable resource management. The community cooperation required for managing shared sanitation facilities created social bonds and mutual dependencies that strengthened village life. When families contributed labor to maintain communal toilets, shared knowledge about effective materials, and coordinated seasonal harvesting activities, they were building social capital that extended far beyond sanitation needs. These cooperative relationships created resilience that helped communities survive economic hardships, natural disasters, and social disruptions. A village that had learned to work together to manage basic sanitation needs had developed organizational skills and social trust that could be applied to other challenges. The practical cooperation around toilet facilities became training for broader community self-governance and mutual aid. The seasonal rhythms that governed material collection and preparation also connected people to natural cycles in ways that influenced their understanding of time, planning, and resource management. Families learned to think in terms of annual cycles, to plan ahead for winter needs, and to take advantage of seasonal opportunities. These skills were essential for survival in pre-industrial societies and created worldviews that emphasized long-term thinking and careful resource management. The regional variations in toilet practices also created cultural identities that distinguished communities and regions from each other. The specific materials used, the particular techniques employed, and the unique solutions developed for local conditions became markers of local identity that connected people to their environments and distinguished them from outsiders. When travelers encountered different toilet practices in distant regions, they weren't just observing functional differences. They were encountering different ways of understanding the relationship between humans and their environment. The smooth stones used by coastal communities, the specialized mosses favored by forest dwellers, and the particular leaves preferred by mountain villages all reflected intimate knowledge of local conditions and resources. These cultural differences became part of regional pride and identity. Communities took satisfaction in their superior solutions to common problems and looked with mild disdain on the inferior practices of their neighbors. This cultural competition actually drove innovation as communities sought to develop better materials and more effective techniques than their rivals. The international exchange of sanitation knowledge through trade, warfare, and diplomatic contact created early examples of technology transfer that would become increasingly important as global connections expanded. When merchants returned from distant lands with knowledge of superior cleaning materials or more effective waste management systems, they were participating in the same kinds of knowledge exchange that would eventually drive the scientific revolution and industrial revolution. The economic systems that developed around sanitation needs also created early examples of specialized markets and service industries that would become models for later economic development. The rag merchants who supplied wealthy households, the night soil men who managed urban waste disposal, and the craftsmen who created specialized sanitation equipment were all pioneers in developing service economies that went beyond basic agricultural production. These early service industries required skills in customer relations, quality control, and market development that would become essential for later economic growth. A successful rag merchant needed to understand his customers' preferences, maintain consistent quality standards, and develop reliable supply chains. These skills were transferable to other industries and helped create the commercial expertise that would drive economic expansion in later centuries. The technological innovations that emerged from toilet practices also contributed to broader technological development. The engineering knowledge required for effective waste disposal systems, the material science understanding needed for developing superior cleaning materials, and the architectural innovations required for better toilet facilities all contributed to growing technical expertise that would eventually be applied to other challenges. The medical knowledge that developed around connections between sanitation practices and health outcomes laid groundwork for later advances in public health and medical understanding. The empirical observations about which practices prevented disease, which materials reduced infections, and which systems promoted community health created early examples of evidence-based approaches to health that would eventually evolve into modern epidemiology and public health practice. Perhaps most importantly, the human dignity that people maintained, despite these challenging circumstances, reveals something profound about the human spirit and our capacity to create meaning and maintain self-respect, even in the most basic aspects of life. The care that families took in preparing cleaning materials, the pride that communities felt in their sanitation systems, and the respect that people showed for each other's privacy and dignity all demonstrate that civilization isn't just about grand achievements in art, literature, or politics. It's about the daily practices through which people treat each other with consideration and respect. The elaborate etiquette that developed around toilet activities, the consideration shown for others' needs and privacy, and the community cooperation required for managing shared facilities all represent civilized behavior at its most fundamental level. These weren't primitive people stumbling through basic functions. They were sophisticated societies that had developed complex systems for maintaining human dignity and community cooperation around the most basic human needs. As we reflect on this journey through the toilet practices of the 16th century, we're reminded that every aspect of human life, no matter how mundane or private, reflects broader patterns of social organization, technological innovation, and cultural creativity. The story of what people used before toilet paper is ultimately a story about human ingenuity, social cooperation, and the endless creativity that people bring to solving basic problems. The next time you reach for that conveniently perforated roll of soft tissue, remember the centuries of human innovation, community cooperation, and individual dignity that preceded your simple action. Behind every modern convenience lies a complex history of human struggle, creativity, and cooperation that connects us to countless generations who faced the same basic needs but found very different solutions. Their legacy lives on not just in the gradual improvements that led to our modern conveniences, but in the fundamental human qualities they demonstrated: ingenuity in the face of challenges, cooperation in building community solutions, and dignity in maintaining respect for human needs and human nature. These qualities remain as essential today as they were 5 centuries ago, reminding us that civilization is built not just through grand achievements, but through the daily practices of treating each other and ourselves with care, creativity, and respect.